Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Tom Duesterberg, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. We're fortunate to have with us today Robert Zoellick, one of the most influential and thoughtful actors in the diplomatic and international economic events of the last nearly 40 years. Bob's book, America in the World, A History of U.S. Diplomacy and Foreign Policy, which I'll put in front of you, is available. I'll say a few words about the book, which I highly recommend. I think it's appropriate for both a general audience who's interested in history, foreign policy, but also a specialist audience of practitioners and professional historians. Bob trained as a lawyer. After clerking the Court of Appeals, he began a distinguished career in public service. He served as counselor to Secretary of the Treasury and State James Baker, Undersecretary of State for Economics at the Department of State, Deputy Secretary of State, President of the World Bank, and the U.S. Trade Representative. He also served as Deputy Chief of Staff at the White House in the first Bush administration. Now Bob is a senior fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard and is on a number of boards of nonprofits and profits. Now, again, this book, which is a good read, it's well written, it's approachable, I think, for a general audience. The unique aspects of this history of diplomacy, to my mind, are he does take a practical bent towards this. Instead of starting with diplomatic history or international relations history, he wants to see events in the context in which they happen and how pragmatic and thoughtful diplomacists and economic policymakers responded to those circumstances. And I quote here from his book, "The concepts from international relations and doctrines help frame debates, but they do not offer policymakers guidance about what to do. The pragmatic practitioners of American diplomacy have had to solve problems in the context of their times. They considered strategic reference points, but prize flexibility, adaptability, and trying what might work." We are going to hear from Bob about some of the episodes that he covers so skillfully. I can say that I learned a lot, and I hope future diplomats will learn a lot from his analyses. So let's hear first from Bob about why he chose to write the book, and perhaps you could give us one example of an episode that you cover in the book with historical context and what lessons you draw from it.
Well, first, Tom, thanks for having me and the generous introduction. The only part you left out was how we work together. So it's a nice opportunity to be with you again. As you said, I think it'd just be helpful for the audience to have a little bit more sense about kind of how I frame the book. The book is a series of stories of how leading Americans sought to deal with their foreign policy problems of their era. So I actually open with Ben Franklin. I run through Bush 41 in 89, 92, and I focus particularly on people and episodes and stories because, as Tom mentioned, I wanted to focus on the practical problem-solving work of diplomacy. And then I had my assessments based on experience, insights on the actual conduct of diplomacy, and along the way, I try to draw out the ideas that I think have contributed to the pluralism of American diplomatic activity and thought over some 200 years. Along the way, I identified 5 traditions, and I was encouraged by a faculty seminar I had looking at drafts that said, oh, you can't end in 1992. So I added an afterword that briefly examines the Clinton, Bush 43, Obama, and a bit of the Trump administrations through the lens of the 5 traditions. But I also just wanted to give a little sense of why I wrote the book, which was when I was in government, I drew upon history as I thought through problems. And I wanted to encourage others, particularly the next generation, to think through that framework. As Tom alluded to, many foreign policy courses these days are taught on the basis of international relations theories. They're intellectually challenging, they're fun to debate, but frankly, I found them of limited use when I was dealing with German unification or trade strategy or China policy or genocide in Darfur or development issues at the World Bank. So I wanted to focus on the practical nature of problem solving. Now, this audience may very well recall Henry Kissinger wrote Diplomacy in the mid-90s, where he used history to talk about foreign policy. Given Dr. Kissinger, it comes from a more European realpolitik perspective, which I think is a valuable one, but I wanted to add to the range of American experience and ideas. And I suppose one other aspect is that when I was in those government posts, I often had younger colleagues. And frankly, I didn't know much about the history how much history they'd learned. So I would often ask them questions, maybe torture them a bit to try to understand. And I discovered that insofar as they had learned history, it tended to be from World War II on. And one of the points of this book is the first 150 years are full of rich episodes and experience, now often lost to the mist of time. I've been encouraged that some of the professors who started to use the book have actually said they've had a good reaction from students because it offers the idea that history can offer insights on how to do better, not just a sense of timeless obstacles. And that frankly, imperfect results in a far from perfect world can often be a responsible sort of course of action. So Tom mentioned kind of the sense of, or other particulars. To give you a little quick flavor, after I talk about Ben Franklin in the Revolution, my first real chapter is on Alexander Hamilton, where I wanted to, and notice, of course, this is the Secretary of the Treasury, as opposed to a Secretary of State, because I wanted to bring attention to economic statecraft. I have a chapter on Thomas Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase. Was he lucky or was he good? Many people in this audience, of course, will have read a lot on the Civil War, generals and battles and slavery and social movements, but very few focus on the foreign policy and how it was critical for Lincoln and Seward to avoid foreign intervention, which was a very near-run thing a couple times during the Civil War. I'd also have an interesting chapter on Teddy Roosevelt. Most of us will recall Teddy Roosevelt as charging up San Juan Hill or the Great White Fleet, the use of power. He actually won the Nobel Peace Prize, the first one for the United States, with the mediation of the Russo-Japanese War and the first Moroccan crisis. And that gave me an opportunity to talk about the role of mediators. In the case of, and Roosevelt was quite skillful at this. He also managed to basically fit the mediation into a larger concept where he wanted to have a balance of power to avoid a breakdown among the great powers, which of course later happens a few years in 1914. And then I go on to more recent periods. One figure that I wanted to draw particular attention to was Charles Evans Hughes, who after the breakdown in Versailles after World War I, launches this Naval Arms Control Conference. And many people think about it purely in arms control terms. It was actually linked to a notion of regional security in Northeast Asia. And that's an interesting insight as people think about North Korea, Iran today. I think one of the insights was arms control has to be connected to a larger sense of your regional security agenda. So I'll skip the more modern ones, Tom, as we get, or maybe our questions can go into it, but maybe that gives people a flavor of the book.
Okay, well, let's dig in on trade, since you were trade representative and lots of issues seem to recur in American history with regard to trade. But you have a chapter mostly devoted to Cordell Hull, who's a little bit less known perhaps to a modern audience, but who's really the father of the modern trading system in many ways. And he was operating as Secretary of State in the height of the Depression. And one of the most famous episodes in American trade history was the Smoot-Hawley set of tariffs. And at the time, Europe was turning inward. It was the rise of the Nazis. The Soviet Union was trying to go it alone economically. So how did Cordell Hull, during the 1930s, conceptualize the role of trade, and how did he develop enough political support in the United States Congress, which had a history of protectionism, let's face it? Can you give us some insights of how he operated and accomplished that?
Yeah, this is a wonderful story of both policy and politics. So as you mentioned, Tom, the context in which he takes office is that the Smoot-Hawley bill raised the average U.S. tariff to 59.1%. And so for some people who like trade surpluses, the U.S. had a trade surplus. It also had 25% unemployment. So the economic conditions were pretty bleak. What's interesting is if you go back and you look at the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act that you mentioned, which becomes the basis of this, it's only 3 pages long. It's amazing in light of Congress today. And as you suggested, it led a historic shift in terms of Congress giving the executive authority to negotiate trade agreements. At that time, the agreement didn't have to come back. They were only for tariff cuts. But one of the points I emphasize in the chapter is that trade was always a political challenge. So people that have studied the New Deal era will know there was a huge transfer of authority to the executive branch in the 30s. Well, for this Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act, at first, Roosevelt wanted it to be a permanent authority, but Congress said, no, only 3 years. And there's always been battles for renewal, and this is what, frankly, was the precursor to what we knew as fast track or trade promotion authority. So it's always been a fight with that. In addition, even after Hull gets the authority, he has a big internal battle with a man lost to history named Greg Peck. And Greg Peck basically wanted to pursue managed trade. We've heard that come back. There were forms of sort of barter agreements, not opening markets. He actually does a deal with Nazi Germany that Franklin Roosevelt approves. And this is probably one of the few times that somebody got the better of Roosevelt in politics, because Hull basically writes a protest on both policy and political ground and concludes it by saying, this is a regime violently opposed by many Americans. And so he gets FDR to back off from it. But then over the course of his tenure until 1944, he negotiates 31 agreements, 28 countries, cuts tariffs really to the pre-Smoot-Hawley level. But more important for the story is each of those agreements includes some core principles: the most favored nation, non-discrimination, reducing barriers into tariffs. And those become the principles for the creation of the GATT in 1947, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. But that brings us right back to the political story, because I highlight a man named Will Clayton, another fascinating figure, quite important for the Marshall Plan, very important in international economics, but didn't get the attention that people like Kennan got. And he was the point person in Geneva trying to negotiate the GATT, starting out with 23 other countries. And while he's in Geneva, Congress passes a 50% wool tariff. And given the membership at that time, or the potential membership, the Australians, heavily dependent on wool, said, if this gets signed into law, we're dropping out. And if Australia dropped out, Britain felt it would have had to drop out. And if Britain dropped out, at that time, most of the continental Europeans were relying on trade with Britain, so they were going to drop out. So Clayton comes all the way back to the United States to have a meeting with Truman. And it's a wonderful little story. Truman gives him 15 minutes, and he gives the Secretary of Agriculture 15 minutes. And so Clayton makes the case on how critical it is to get the world economy going again with this new GATT system, urges Truman to veto the bill. The Secretary of Agriculture, Tom, you will have heard this many times, said, well, you'll lose up to 7 states in the 1948 election if you don't sign this bill. Well, the next day, Truman decides to veto the bill, even authorizes Clayton to cut the wool tariff. The negotiations proceed. For those people who don't recall history, I will remind them that Truman did win the 1948 election despite this dire warning. And so part of the point of the story is that trade politics is always a challenge. And as you say, today protectionism is back in vogue. I think one of the insights I would like to draw is the importance of the U.S. Leading in developing rules for cutting edge sectors. So people on this with this event would be aware, given the nature of the U.S. economy, traditionally U.S. negotiators have had to sort of expand the set of rules for services, intellectual property, transparency, anti-corruption, technology, because we're a cutting edge sort of economy. We've stopped doing that. And the most recent statements by Ambassador Tai suggest that we're going to continue to be in a stall, where the alternative would be rebuild the political effort to rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is all based basically on US procedures. If that's too politically difficult to start with a digital accord where, again, this would emphasize freedom of information flow. There are pieces of such an accord in various agreements we could use. The USMCA, the rewrite of NAFTA, in my view, has labor provisions that I wouldn't put in, but if it got support for the Congress, why not use that as a basis for a North American negotiation with Britain, and so on and so forth. So the question would be, even for the WTO, what I've understood privately is the US has, of course, stymied the dispute settlement process. But when our friends have asked, well, what would you like to have fixed to get back in? We haven't even given them something. So if you don't go to the table, you're not likely to get things done. And so in a sense, it's a historical cautionary warning about the United States stalling on trade as we're doing today.
Okay, let me go a little bit further into sort of the parallels, loose parallels between the period of the 1930s and the post-war period of the 1940s, where what's now called the liberal trading order was put together by some really visionary thinkers, and people like Will Clayton that you mentioned are largely unknown to history, but played a vital role. And people underestimate, I think, the difficulty of getting those agreements that eventually led to constituted the Bretton Woods Agreement, the modern trading system. Those were not straightforward. Even our friends, the Brits, led by John Maynard Keynes, wanted to maintain the imperial system of imperial preferences. The Soviet Union wanted to go it alone. The French wanted to keep the Germans in a state of a rural economy, which was, anyway, all those obstacles had to be overcome. But another factor from the 1930s, you mentioned the centralization of government power. And during the Second World War, let's face it, there was a command and control economy. And today, in the wake of the rise of China, heavy subsidization of industry by China, there is something of a bipartisan effort to revive industrial policy, like they did in the New Deal to deal with the Great Depression, then the war. And of course, this would be if it succeeds, quite a challenge to the liberal trading order. Do you have any lessons you can draw from, especially perhaps the period of the 1940s when they put that system in place, of how they overcame those political obstacles and set in motion, as you describe in your book, a economic system in the United States which was incredibly innovative and growth oriented, and it brought the rest of the world along with it. So it's a little wordy question, but could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think I draw two strands, Tom. First, what's interesting, and you alluded to this, is that in 1945, 6, and 7, there's actually a shift from the Morgenthau, Harry Dexter White view at the Treasury Department to the State Department team, Marshall, Clayton, sort of Atchison. And Ben Steele in his book on the Marshall Plan, I think identifies the basis of this. Really, the Bretton Woods model of 1944 sort of assumed a political context of US-Soviet cooperation, safe receding of the British Empire, and reestablished trade that would be supported by modest balance of payment support. Well, if you ask yourself, by 1946 and 47, all of those proved incorrect. So one can look at the early effort with the UN and IMF as efforts to maintain peace and stability rather than to manufacture it. And so by 1947, what's impressive about Marshall is his pragmatism in sort of understanding the conditions and backed, of course, by Truman recognizing this. And one of the points I try to draw out in the book is that way this is sometimes described in history as that people had this grand strategy. It didn't work out that way at all. People were trying to address the problems of their era. So if you take the Marshall Plan was Marshall's recognition that after spending 6 weeks in Moscow, that Stalin wanted Western Europe to degrade because that would create the context for sort of communism. So he comes back with this rough idea of needing to do something. And the Marshall Plan, of course, was an economic design, at first to avoid an American military commitment to the region. But then the second recognition was the Marshall Plan wouldn't work unless you had at least part of Germany be part of it. So this moves from the Morgenthau Plan, as you described, to pasteurize Germany, to creating the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949. That creation is one of the events that led to the Berlin blockade and the need for security with the Soviet Union. But also it led, as you mentioned, for the French and other Europeans to say, well, if we're going to recreate Germany, we need some greater security. So then the third element was the creation of the North Atlantic Alliance. But this was not a game plan. This basically gets developed. And then on top of it is the story we talked about with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And you may be one of the only people to know this, Tom. This was, of course, an alternative to what was called the ITO. There was an idea of an international trade organization. It was much more sort of UN-based in terms of controls, I guess I would say. And the GATT system was a thinner system. So in a sense, the story is how this group of practical people recognized how national interests were related to the international interest. And as opposed to seeing them in conflict, as we sometimes discuss today, see them as two sides of the same coin. Now, there's a second theme, however, that you touch on, and you will recall this, but I have a chapter in the book by a man called Vannevar Bush. And you won't find him in most foreign policy books because he's basically a scientist and technologist. And in fact, I introduced that chapter, you can't make this up, with 3 events in July 1945. One, you've got the atomic bomb test, and he was the liaison to FDR with the development of the atomic bomb. Second, he produces this report called Science, the Endless Frontier, where he's trying to develop the future of American science policy. And then third, a little known aspect, he writes an article in the Atlantic magazine where he's basically sort of conceiving of what we would know as the personal computer. It was a desktop device to link the information all around the world. And of course, this is the area where just big computers are starting. And what I found fascinating was there's a reprint of that article that shows up in a Red Cross library in Leyte, where a guy who goes over as a radar technician reads it, comes back and is one of the founders of the personal computer movement. And of course, one of Vannevar Bush's graduate students is the founder of Silicon Valley. So you see these aspects, but in the science aspect, the report about Science, the Endless Frontier, of course, moves us beyond thinking about foreign policy simply as geographic frontiers and geopolitics, but also science and technology. And Bush had this idea, which he had operationalized in World War II, but then recommended afterwards, where the US would play a role with investment in basic scientific research. It would be connected to universities, and then the universities would be connected to industry. So in Stanford, this is called the sort of the triple helix model. But contrary to what we're seeing in some parts today, the focus was very much on basic research. It wasn't how to try to subsidize a bunch of industries. Now, the relevance of this today is that, Senator Todd Young from Indiana actually sponsored a bill called the Endless Frontier Bill. And this isn't accidental because we've talked about this stuff. And so I think someone like Senator Young wants to support the important research and development. But going back to your point about sort of imitating the Chinese in terms of state involvement, I would urge people to look closely at things like the semiconductor financing, because you and I both know, Tom, there's going to be a lot of industries that will have their hand out. And it's one thing to make sure you've got resilience. It makes another thing you've got different sourcing, R&D and cutting edge areas. That's a little different than deciding to subsidize capital intensive fab production aspects, trying to control the whole supply chain. So we will encounter more of these with the competition of China. And I think there's going to need to be some care done where we maintain what makes the US scientific and technology sector's distinctiveness, not a question of state control and state domination. That didn't work for the Soviet Union. I think ultimately it's not going to work for China. But at the same time, we do this with some discipline. So, to close this, Vannevar Bush was also a fiscal conservative. Now, his model probably wouldn't work today because it was sort of an elite model. He wanted to control the research and development ideas. And even in his era, you can see it expands quickly to, various silos and everybody wanting their own sort of subsidy program. But this is a good example, again, of where, in addition to the sort of insights from history, one can perhaps have some questions and thoughts about how we're approaching things today.
Okay, the subject of China has come up several times, and you brought up the work of Teddy Roosevelt. You have a chapter on John Hay and the open door policy. Franklin Roosevelt insisted on having China at the table and as a member of the permanent member of the Security Council of the UN. We have a long history with China that's generally not very well known. So I wonder if there are any thoughts you might have from, for instance, Teddy Roosevelt's effort, and John Hay's efforts too, to sort of build international agreement on how to deal with problems related to China, and whether or not we're doing a good enough job today doing the same thing of building international consensus on what we want to accomplish with China.
So there's three interesting historical themes that come out with America's interaction with China over the years. The first is the notion of China as a vast commercial opportunity, usually just shining over the horizon. And this actually starts before the Constitution. I draw attention to Robert Morris, who really was the financier during the Revolution. He finances a ship called the Empress of China in 1784. It brings ginseng from Appalachia to China, and it has huge profits. I have a book in the basement that I discovered. It's titled 400 Million Customers, and it's from the 1930s. And it was the idea how the great China market would always boost the opportunities for America. So one is the commercial prospects in China. The second, as you alluded to, is recognizing China as a potential power, an actor in the international system. So the open door policy was partly economic, but it was significantly designed to maintain China's territorial integrity. This was an era, people will recall, where the Europeans had been carving up Africa, and that could have happened in the case of China as well. Teddy Roosevelt, in the mediation, as you mentioned, is very intent on trying to preserve China's coherence and, again, not be carved up by the different players. Charles Evans Hughes, who I mentioned in the 1920s, part of his strategy in the East Asia context was to create a basis for the new Republic of China to get control of its revenues and start to sort of modernize the system. For Franklin Roosevelt, it was the four policemen afterwards. Now, the third theme, however, is also important, which is the missionary experience. Americans that know a little bit about relations with China will know that for well over 100 years, Americans have been trying to convert China to Christianity, to capitalism, to small r republicanism. And if you look at the children of missionaries or the returning missionaries, they're very influential. Pearl Buck, with her book, The Good Earth, made into a movie influencing opinion. Henry Luce with Time Magazine. A lot of the foreign service officers, including some that we work with, were children of missionaries. It was a huge influence, of course, in the universities. Now, the other side of this effort to convert China is when China rejected our efforts, the Boxer Rebellion, some aspects of the 1920s, 1949, 1989, the US responds with particular hostility. You don't see this relationship with a place like India. There's a pendulum of attitudes towards China. And I guess what I would suggest based on this is it's important to recognize China for what it is, not what we wish it to be. They have realistic aspirations, but also to recognize its importance in Asia. So today, I think we're actually at a increasingly dangerous point, because I think many Americans, of course, will look at the end of the Cold War in Europe as a historical event. For Xi Jinping, this is a part of current reality. A favorite anecdote that I explain is that when he took power in 2012, he created a documentary film about the end of the Soviet Union and ordered all the party cadres to see it. Now, if that film were shown in Europe, you'd probably have Gorbachev as the hero that helped end the Cold War. Well, the Chinese version is a little different. Gorbachev's the man that abandoned the Communist Party, led to his country to ruin, and the not so subtle message is it's not going to happen here. So the number one focus is on the Chinese Communist Party regime stability. There's also, I think, a view in China about the East being on the rise, East rising, West declining. I think over the past years, Xi has concluded that the US cannot accept China's rise. And so I think we're now in an era of standoff and protracted struggle. And I think you've seen a shift in Chinese thinking where they're now increasingly skeptical of cooperative dialogues. They want to engage to avoid misperceptions, miscalculations. They don't want to have conflict. But particularly with the economic efforts, which frankly, I think Ambassador Tai's speech continues, they see the Americans as decoupling. And not surprisingly, as you know, the other side gets a vote and they're going to decouple on their own terms, which you can see happening in different ways. So to pull this together, I think the US is at some point going to have a complicated mix of deterrence, particularly with allies, competition, but also some areas of cooperation. I don't believe you can contain China. I don't, it's interesting with Ambassador Tai's speech, she says the discussion doesn't work, negotiations didn't work, enforcement didn't work. Well, then what exactly does she have in mind to do here? Now, and there was some of the things I talked about in the trade area could help the US rebuild leverage, could leverage with other parties in particular. If our trade policy looks like it's just designed to increase US sales to China, as I think happened in the past, and Ambassador Tai seems to be continuing, well, don't expect other countries to join into that effort. If you have an effort that's designed to have a fairer set of rules and openness and higher standards and protections, that you can rally people around, but not just helping the United States be sort of mercantilist. So I think we're going to see this play out over the course of the next set of years. And so the historical experience is somewhat interesting. I think the pendulum has now shifted back to an area of extreme hostility, and we'll see where that takes us.
Just a minor point here. One of the touch points right now and acute problems is Taiwan. It's important economically, but in Chinese, the Chinese dream, the Chinese vision of where they sit in the world, it seems to have a crucial importance. Do you think our efforts 100 years ago to assist China in maintaining what you call territorial integrity, and China it grew and it contracted over the course of many years. Did we make a mistake 100 years ago in convincing the Chinese that we were supporters of their what they define as their territorial integrity?
Well, I guess I would suggest that looking at Taiwan through a pragmatic lens today, I don't think that if you try to do counterfactuals about splitting up China as Africa was split up, that starts to get a little too confusing for my calculation. I think the challenge with Taiwan is the United States, for its own security reasons in the region, in other words, reassurance to Japan, Australia, other allies, should try to protect Taiwan's autonomy as a political system, its market economics. That is different than saying you're going to support an independent Taiwan. If you're going to try to support an independent Taiwan, I think you have to be ready, given the Chinese view of their past, for a military conflict. And I think that would be a very serious issue for all people involved. This goes back a little bit to the view that discussions and negotiations with China don't produce everything. I think you were part of this, but in the first Bush administration, I managed to get Taiwan into APEC at the same time with Hong Kong and China. In 2001, I got Taiwan into the WTO, and I actually got the Chinese to accept the role for Taiwan in the World Health Assembly at the time. So I think at least in the past, there was a path to try to accomplish this. I think to take this a step further, Bob Blackwell and Phil Zelikow did a very interesting study for the Council on Foreign Relations, looking at the operational aspects of this. So moving beyond the headlines of whether you have sort of a broad statement of policy with Taiwan, and some of the operational questions are not only traditional types of invasion. They're an issue like the blockade. So if you want to have the historical analogy, go look to Cuba in 1962. You could imagine where China could actually blockade not all trade, but military supplies to the island. And then it's a question of what the US and its partners will do, pushing the onus back on us. And one thing that's very clear is that the US options in such a situation are very limited if you don't have a close relationship with Japan. So you can see the discussions going on now in the nature of the Japanese side. So where I differ from some people, Tom, is I think we have a very strong interest in trying to support Taiwan's democracy, its economic system. However, this is where I'll bring in the pragmatism. If you want to support Taiwan's independence, be ready for war. And I'm not sure we are.
Okay, well, that's clear enough. We're coming a little bit toward the end of our allotted time, but Bob, I wanted to give you a chance to talk about series of episodes when you were working with Secretary Baker and others in the first Bush administration. And one of the great accomplishments, I think, of that administration was allowing the peaceful breakup of the Warsaw Pact and later the Soviet Union. You were intimately involved in that. But you describe in your book some episodes that I don't think the modern public would fully understand, and put a lot of weight on the efforts, for instance, to negotiate a conventional forces agreement. And it was looking 2 or 3 steps ahead, and it eventually helped to smooth the path for the unification of Germany. Could you remind our audience a little bit about what the context was like that you all faced and navigated, I think, relatively successfully?
Well, of course, the story really does start with Ronald Reagan, as you know, and the sort of rebuilding America's economic strength, the military power, but also willing to negotiate. And George Shultz played a key role with that. Reagan was a very tough negotiator. And of course, to bring back the economic theme, one cannot ignore the collapse of energy prices in the mid 80s with the effect on the Soviet Union. This has a huge, they were so dependent on energy resources, still, by the way, heavily today. And that really weakens Gorbachev, and he decides he has to experiment, although he didn't know where he was going. The reason I draw that out is one point I was trying to touch on in the book was that recently the past Secretary of State Schultz would have said, look, the Cold War ended by 1988. My view was, and this is the view of the Bush administration, was the Cold War doesn't end in Europe until we create a Europe whole and free. The Cold War started because of the division of Germany and Berlin and Europe. And so that was the aim strategically to try to end the Cold War peacefully. And the incident that you're talking about is one I used to draw out the Bush's strength as an alliance leader. Part of the Reagan accomplishments was this INF treaty, the intermediate range negotiation, which eliminated those intermediate range missiles. They left, however, the short range missiles. And as one German politician said at the time, the shorter the missiles, the deader the Germans. And of course, there was a movement by NATO to modernize those missiles. The Germans didn't want to take that approach. They actually wanted to negotiate it. So when Bush came into office early in '89, we faced what people now forget was sort of an alliance crisis. And this is important because many historians focus simply on the relationship with the Soviet Union in '89-90. Bush's first approach was to strengthen the base with his allies. It's almost like a domestic political approach. You have to have your base strength. And he could see the appeal of Gorbachev to the German public. So he comes up with this very bold conventional forces proposal, which was to drastically reduce and equalize conventional forces in Europe. This is in May of '89. Now, this has some very important implications. Number one, the short-range nuclear missile issue becomes less important because if you equalize forces, frankly, you didn't have the need to have the nuclear missiles as an alternative to large conventional forces that the Soviets could have. It frankly starts to get the Red Army to leave Eastern Europe, which was our game. It makes it harder for the Soviets to come back to Eastern Europe, but you could also make the case to Gorbachev that it would reduce his costs much more, frankly, than the nuclear areas. And of course, what it does is it seals a German-American partnership because you're dealing with Bush establishes himself as alliance leader. He works through the German political problem. He shows movement. All this, by the way, in May, and it's amusing because historians will refer to the long pause in policy. And what they're ignoring is Bush first focused on his alliance partners in strengthening the relationship. And that, of course, sets the context for the events that you mentioned, after November 9th, when the wall comes down and we were able to unify Germany and NATO within 10, 11 months. So I wanted to recall the alliance management, the role of the CFE negotiation. And if I put one other thought in your mind, Tom, since I've talked about Charles Evans Hughes and arms control and linked to regional security, I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal, maybe a year or two now, where I suggested that with North Korea, perhaps one should start with a conventional forces negotiation. That's the real sort of danger to be able to deal with, and the hot wire issue. And if North Korea is serious about wanting to try to create a different economic opportunity, let's look at those. But I was partly trying to put that in the context of saying, if you try to deal with nuclear missiles alone in North Korea, you're ignoring the economic aspects, the humanitarian aspects, the regional security aspects. There's questions about missiles for Japan, and one has to look at these in a combined effort. Now, whether it would work or not, I'm not in a position to say, but I'm trying to stretch people's thinking about how to deal with some of these arms control issues in a regional security context.
One final question, again, sort of returning to the link between sort of economics and foreign policy with regard to Europe and China. We have not done a very good job of working, if you will, with our traditional allies, especially in Europe, perhaps a little better with the Japanese, on a shared view of the Chinese challenge and how we can work more constructively together in things like the World Trade Organization. And that's due in part to continuing frictions between the United States and Europe on economic issues of one sort or another. We had the Boeing dispute, we had now the submarine sale dispute, but agriculture has always been a tough issue between the United States and Europe. Should we be more open to negotiating some of these economic issues with Europe as a means to get to a better cooperative relationship that may lead to some more shared approach to, especially to China?
Well, I think the starting point, Tom, as you know, is often stop doing dumb things. So the Trump administration imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum from Europe under the argument that they were a national security threat. That's hard for me to grasp the logic of that other than pure protectionism. And so, again, what I found missing in Ambassador Tai's statement is that she basically says, well, nothing's worked with China. I'll have some further discussions. I guess it's hard for me to say, but there's no sense of, well, if you want to bring the Europeans on your side to put pressure on China, why not remove the tariffs on steel and aluminum? And it's sort of ironic, the same week, Tony Blinken's off to Paris to try to rebuild relations. Maybe that would have been a good thing that they compared some notes and said, okay, had that sort of in his pocket. It's a broader issue. So I alluded to this. If the United States was frustrated with the WTO dispute settlement mechanism, basically paralyzed it, I think, frankly, some of the people in the WTO, including the Europeans, would be willing to try to do some things that would deal with some of the American political concerns. But it's hard to solve a problem if you haven't taken a position. I mean, so without getting too technical, there are provisions called safeguards in the trading system, and they're supposed to be used temporarily for sort of wounded industries. I'm not saying I'm a big fan of them, but if you're worried about protectionist politics, you can use safeguards more effectively than the types of things we've done. And the WTO provisions somewhat restricted those. So whether it's procedural aspects or others, you could work out some of those aspects with Europe. But the bigger picture is a theme that you and I have touched on, which is that if the US approaches trade in a mercantilist model, which the China sales package did, which the goods that they're supposed to buy from us as an overall volume amount, and by the way, then don't buy from others, as opposed to the US leadership in framing the rules of the international system, which we tried to do with free trade agreements, Trans-Pacific Partnership, and others, you're not going to get the support of others. And this goes, while we mentioned Europe, it's definitely true in the Asia strategy. So I tried to explain what I think are some of the serious problems we face in China, but the Japanese, the Koreans, the Indians, the Australians, they're not going to decouple economically from China. So you're going to need to have a strategy where you can sort of build support for advanced rules that serve our interest and compliance, as the Australians have said, against the Chinese. And then frankly, you're going to have to at least talk to the Chinese to figure out where some of their own interests are in terms of having a more reciprocal trading system. What you're seeing now is a total decoupling. And in some areas of technology, I can understand we're going to need to have those protections. But it's interesting, if you look at the Trump sales package to China, it included a lot of semiconductor sales. So which way do we want it? Do we not want to sell some of those or to hit the numbers, or do we want to sort of keep them all at home? And what this again forces a recognition is some semiconductors are not all equal. There's some that are at sort of lower levels of high performance. And if we don't sell them, frankly, our own industries are going to get weak. So this is where I think the challenge with China is going to be, as I said, you have to look at it realistically in a cold-blooded way. But on the same time, if you're going to cooperate on issues, whether economics or climate or biological security, you're best doing it if you can sort of bring people to your side. And I'm afraid so far what you see is, I think the administration with the AUKUS agreement, the Australian, the UK, US agreement for security is a good step. But it's sort of ironic, Tom. We're defending the sea lanes of the Pacific, but we don't want our commercial business to be on the sea lanes. So we're doing the security work while someone else gets the economic benefit. So this is what I hope we'll see some shift on.
Okay, well, on that note, we've covered a lot of territory. It's been a hugely interesting discussion. I've learned a lot. I appreciate your taking the time to chat with us. Again, I want to highly recommend your what I've called a magisterial book. Again, thanks. And thank you to our audience for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Tom, and good luck with all of your activities. And you're in Hudson. Thank you.
Thank you.